And John can correct during the panel discussion, but unlike the NRDA assessment where BP is likely to foot most of the bill, the sources of funding to implement this kind of restoration plan are yet to be identified. And of course, there's not an awful lot of optimism in the Congress and in the administration now as to the abundance of money to spend on much of anything yet, especially an uncharted and so far unplanned sort of restoration effort. But as was referred to before, and I'm going to dwell on this for the last few minutes, the Gulf of Mexico system is clearly stressed by many more things than the Macondo oil spill, and has been for decades. And so this hiccup, as Ed, I think, termed it, Ed Overton termed it, is certainly a burp, perhaps, but compared to what restoration means in the broadest context of Gulf of Mexico systems is something that needs to be considered. There's been a lot of debate over what the perturbations to the system are a result of, and in the early days of this discussion, geologists would argue that it's a natural part of the system evolving. Delta lobes are created, new marshes are created, and at the same time, since the sediment's going here and isn't going somewhere else, we're losing by subsidence and by natural processes lobes. So we have this balance of accretion, building of land, and loss of land by very natural geologic processes. And certainly historical studies of the delta through Pleistocene times indicate that that's the case. But then, of course, the human perturbations are very clear. Levied systems to allow for navigation, to allow flood control to be effective and protect citizens from the very nurturing sediments and water that feed the ecosystems have been pervasive in the delta. The navigation systems themselves have been an important part of the economy. Arguments about whether production of oil and gas in the delta system itself have caused the subsidence that has been a contributor to the sinking of parts of the delta. And certainly, as you can see front and center in this photograph, the dredging of canals for pipelines for access to oil and gas sites have affected not only the area of acreage of marsh that's there, but have affected the whole hydrology, the flow of salt and fresh waters with tides and other purposes into the wetlands, and altered that hydrologic setting to a significant degree. So the wetlands have been beat up for a long, long time. Nature has done it, storms have done it in addition to geologic processes, people have done it. And so it's on this backdrop, on this backlog of problems that we look at trying to restore the Gulf of Mexico and restore the wetlands. I'm glad I have this map in there because it was referred to by the last panel, but this just illustrates very clearly, and I'll show you a couple more that are even more dramatic, what we're talking about in terms of land loss. This is 1932 to 2000, work by the USGS and others illustrating the wetlands that have been lost, the wetlands that are threatened. And you do see in a little blip of green there in the center part, some land has been created. There is some sediment, there is some water from the Atchafalaya coming into the system, and so we are building very small parts of land. This is nothing like the system fed by the Mississippi and its tributaries or its distributaries that built the delta itself. But around that sediment supply that's building very small lobes into the wetlands area now, that much of the controversy about restoration of the Gulf survives. It's a little more vivid, a little fuzzier, but a little more vivid illustration of the same sorts of thing. You can see dramatic changes and losses of wetland areas, particularly in the Mississippi River area itself, to the east and west of the delta. And then if we extend that 32 to 2050 in the central part of the Gulf, this is really scary. I mean, this is what we're looking at as having happened and likely to happen, natural processes, human processes, storms, and so forth, and then we add the oil to it. And one of the early questions added was, now, is the oil going to really add to the loss of wetlands? Will they be dealt a blow by the oil itself that they wouldn't have had otherwise, and therefore the resiliency of the wetlands will be threatened even more? I think the answer to that right now is we don't know. We'll have to see over the coming growing seasons whether these wetland pieces come back again, the ones that were oiled. But this is the footprint, this is the picture that we're looking at as we talk about restoring the Gulf of Mexico system onshore. Restoring the Gulf of Mexico system offshore, it's hard to imagine anything we would do physically to go in there, even if we found oil in the traditional form on the bottom, and actually try to restore those habitats. There aren't any practical ways. Certainly we can restore the species, the ecosystems that depend on that, if they're commercial, by managing the captures of those systems and trying to manage those natural systems with our human efforts. But then you get into arguments over, well, are the red drum down this year because of the oil, or are they down because they're in one of their down years that they go through anyway? Same thing with other species. So it's a very complex thing. But physically, we won't restore the Gulf of Mexico systems in terms of bottom conditions or water conditions. Physically, we can restore the wetland systems, not so much by going in and cleaning up the oil that's coating the vegetation or still left in the sands and muds on the beaches and in the margins of the wetlands, but by restoring, by reestablishing those forces that created the delta in the first place. And this is where it gets really interesting and very difficult. There is a plethora, if that's the right word, of plans to restore coastal Louisiana. Secretary Salazar mentioned that this morning, that in his looking at the history of the depredation in some senses of the Gulf wetland systems, there have been many efforts and many plans put together to restore these, and they have an interesting history because they all, not all, many in some form try to replicate what nature did in building the delta. In other words, getting more water, more sediment into areas that are being lost as wetlands disappear through subsidence and through disappearance by other means. They all have evolved to some degree from being dependent on relatively small projects, diversions of water, diversions of sediment that have been relatively successful, but postage stamp, if that large, in terms of their impacts. And so the great wish, the great hope has been, boy, if we could just find a way to pump the amount of water and the amount of sediment into the system that was there originally, we would have a chance to restore that red, raging red wetland area to some sense of the habitats that it was before by creating the sediment substrate upon which these marsh vegetation could grow. So we've gone from small systems with the BRO Act, the QIPRA kind of program, to great schemes and ideas about big systems. The problem is big systems run into big controversies, run into big conflicts with the existing infrastructure, with the existing economy, with the existing settlement pattern, with all of those things that are held dear in the South Louisiana area, but which are at risk, and which, if you bring in a lot of water and sediment, you put them more at risk by them being in the way. So, sediment and fresh water. How do you bring large amounts of water and sediment to restore the wetlands? Well, there are those, and there's another set of numbers that's being debated accurately. There are those who say, no way. There's just not enough sediment in the Mississippi River system to do that again. The dams on the Missouri in particular have trapped significant amounts of sediment, so it isn't even getting to Louisiana anymore. Because of the required diversion of a third or so of the flow down the Atchafalaya, some of it goes down there, and to change that pattern would require, literally, according to some, an act of Congress. So if we don't have enough sediment, and if we have problems getting it in the right place, we're starting off with one hand tied behind our back. How do you get the sediment that comes down the river that's there into the right place? Right now it comes down the Mississippi, heads out past Venice and drops off the edge of the continental shelf. That's not doing any wetlands any good at all. It's not getting into the wetlands by overbank flooding because the levees are there to protect people that keep it from getting there. So, zoom, it's out to sea. Well, geez, if we could just find a way to get that sediment into the wetlands, whatever amount's there, and the fresh water, we've got a chance. So there have been all kinds of ideas. Run it down the Lafourche old distributary. Well, of course, the people in Lafourche weren't necessarily excited about that. The most recent and interesting thought is, well, let's just chop off the lower part of the Mississippi River. We don't need that, in a sense. Create a new mouth for the Mississippi, right at about the present coastline of the main part of the coastline of the state. Let that water head laterally into the coastal wetlands area so the sediment that's there ends up on the shelf, washed into the wetlands, and has a chance to nourish that. Well, that's an interesting idea. Geologically, it makes a fair amount of sense. Navigation people aren't too crazy about it, even though people will argue that really it would make a shorter trip up the Mississippi if you brought shipping up at that point. So here's a big scale, big idea to restore the wetlands beyond the oil spill, beyond the small demonstration projects, that manages the water and sediment at the scale it needs to be managed, that amount that we actually have. And so it's in play right now. So some of the coastal plans, the state's master plan, for example, that has come about mentions those sorts of things. The Corps is a little reluctant to even consider something of that magnitude. Kind of scares the heck out of them, actually, because it really flies in the face of navigation, flood control kinds of things. So moving the federal agency, understandably, beyond that point of entrenchment is hard. But there are people thinking about that sort of thing. And then certainly the major infrastructure modifications that I mentioned before are factors that have to be dealt with. How do you handle the levees, and how do you handle the navigation, and how do you handle flood control in light of making major changes like that? The point of all this really is that restoration plan for the Gulf, if it's seriously going to affect areas of the Gulf in general that need restoration, and particularly the wetlands and beaches, is going to have to involve restoring the wetlands in a large-scale sort of way. That goes beyond the oil spill, but the problems of the Gulf, as pointed out by the previous panel, go far beyond the oil spill and is part of a much greater need. Perhaps, as pointed out, that the fact that the attention has been drawn to the Gulf, that people nationally are understanding the scale of the problem, and that the kinds of numbers that we who are in Louisiana argued for years should make a national impact, the amount of fisheries, the amount of migratory birds, the fur bearers, all of those things that are so critical not just to the economy of the Gulf states, particularly Louisiana, but are critical to the country, depend on these ecosystems. So restoration has to imply more than restoring the oil spill effects. It has to imply restoring a Gulf Coast system that the country depends on for many purposes. So if we're going to restore the natural systems, then we're going to have to depend on time, the weathering of the oil, the removal of the oil, hopefully non-anaerobic approaches to removing the oil and other products from that. And so time will have to do it. I think the arguments for scientific understanding that we didn't get from ICTOC, that we need to get from this, are certainly pervasive and certainly very strong. And hopefully the BP funding will allow that to happen. So we have a better understanding. And we who live in the Gulf area have argued for decades that we are kind of the forgotten ocean, and that the reason we need so much science in the Gulf is because we haven't had so much in the past. And hopefully this will draw that monitoring and assessment kinds of scientific capabilities into the Gulf that we haven't had to the past, and that we will do an adequate job of monitoring the recovery and the restoration efforts. And let me close with the latest chapter. Most of the plans that I outlined in that slide were restoration plans. They were concerned with habitats. They were concerned with ecosystems. They were concerned with beaches and barrier islands to protect the coast. Hurricane protection really wasn't a top priority because we really hadn't had a really bad one for a long time. So the thought was the natural system and its productive role in nature and in human systems. Then 2005, two major hurricanes within a month, Katrina and Rita, devastated the Gulf Coast area. And I'm not going to go into that story, but I certainly want to say that that does have a way of changing thinking, because the effort certainly and understandably and not arguably has turned to how do we do a better job of understanding what protection means of lives and property, not only physical, constructional, engineering sorts of things, but relocational things, and that approach to hurricane protection. So most of what we've seen now and the funding that we've seen directed into the Gulf of Mexico, into Louisiana, and particularly into the New Orleans area has been for hurricane protection, to put up walls and levees and solid structures and gates and water control structures that will protect those people and property. Certainly not everyone in the coastal area is going to be protected, but the major centers. So how do you then work backwards in a sense and say, well, restoration needs to be part of hurricane protection, much like hurricane protection in the earlier days we're saying that needs to be part of the restoration plan. Well, now we're flip-flopped again. So how do you build a hurricane protection system that doesn't add woes to the losses of wetlands, so that you shut off waters, that you shut off sediments? Tough job. Tough job. Caught in the middle of all this is the Corps. Caught in the middle of all this is the state of Louisiana's coastal agencies and the scientific community. So we're back in it again, slugging it out, arguing it out, and hopefully the science that comes out of all of this concern about the spill and concern about the wetlands and concern about hurricane protection will lead us to a plan that's truly integrated, truly serves purposes, and most importantly, as Secretary Salazar pointed out, gets over that problem that the area's had for so long, no money. How do you pay for not only hurricane protection, but how do you pay for restoration of the Gulf? Great challenge.